Okay, so today's webinar very quickly is going to be about resilience and how it can be applied to the sphere of understanding sustainable peace in the Anthropocene. When we talk about resilience, we can mean many, many different things. In essence, what it really boils down to is the capacity of a system, whether it's a community, a nation, or a region, to deal with change, whether that's incremental and abrupt, expected and surprising, and at the same time, this community or nation or region to be able to continue to develop. And we're in this really turbulent time now. We talk of it as the Anthropocene, where surprise and turbulence is much more common than before. And at the same time, in parallel with this, resilience has really evolved and in its use as a way to assess and identify risks and needs, and ways to help prevent and mitigate against natural or man-made crisis. But resilience is much more than that. It's actually a very broad palette of tools and approaches and theories that you can apply and help you get a systemic lens on how to generate peace building and conflict resolution. So we'll dive right into this webinar. And what we'll be doing in this webinar is expose some of the different perspectives on how resilience thinking is being applied in research and practice in order to confront and understand security and conflict risks in the Anthropocene. My name is Norström. I'm a researcher at the Stockholm Resilience Center, but I'm also the head of knowledge and evidence at the Global Resilience Partnership, and you're very welcome to this webinar. And for those of you just joining in now, we apologize for the slight delay in the webinar. There were some technical issues initially. Our four panelists today are Cibele Queiroz. She's the theme leader at the Stockholm Resilience Center, but also a researcher with the Global Resilience Partnership. We have Cedric de Koning, who's a research professor at the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs. Jennifer Abdellah, who's a program director of the Climate Resilience Development Group at the Neary's Foundation. And Jessica Spikers, who's a research associate with the Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Organization, CSIRO. And they'll each be giving a different slice of this puzzle, a short presentation, 5 to 10 minutes, before then we engage them with a few questions. And like always with these Zoom webinars, the way you deliver your questions is through the Q&A button down in your kind of tool panel at the bottom of the screen. You can also do it to the chat, but we prefer you use the Q&A function because then it's more transparent and easy to follow where the questions come from. So before further ado, we'll jump right into it and I'll ask Cibele to give her opening presentation. Thanks.
Thank you, Albert. Let me just try to share my screen. So I'll just try to be quick, but so my talk will be about one of the collaborative actions that we are having at GRP, but that is in collaboration with several of our partners. It is called Seeds of Resilience for Peace and Stability. And this presentation will be about this project that aims to investigate how local initiatives, and they might be, so in this project, these are sort of local initiatives that are being supported by some of our partners, but where sort of the focus is very much on the local community and sort of enabling the capacities of local communities in conflict areas, how these initiatives can contribute to sort of to resilience to conflict and in these areas and to peace building. And sort of very much in particular, this sort of our approach is to look into the potential of these initiatives to contribute to really transformative change. So sort of towards sustainable peace in these places. And just to give you a very short background of where does this come from. So sort of this, so this project is a sub-project or part of a broader approach that is called Seeds of the Good Anthropocene. And it started as a sort of a research collaboration, which basically was moving beyond just having these like really dystopic ideas of the future where sort of everything can go wrong, and started to think about, what could be sort of bright spots or really good examples, so sort of like seeds of a better future in different parts of the world that would be like the seeds of a future that would be more sustainable, more just, etc. So sort of initiatives that can contribute to sustainability. And what this project did is that they created a big database where people could come and sort of contribute with different initiatives they knew about, or initiatives that they were sort of leading or engaging with, that they thought that had the potential of being transformative. And the common thing with these initiatives is that they are all starting locally, and many of them even marginal. So they are not sort of mainstream. And therefore because of that, they can also contain like very innovative elements that, you know, might or might not be transformative, but that have the potential to do that, and potentially also to scale up. And then of course that some will do and some don't. But the aim of our project is also to try to understand that sort of when they are successful, what are the elements that can lead to that success and to positive transformation. And I'm not going to go in details in this figure, but basically this is a figure about the theory of change, of how these seeds can actually be scaled up or scaled broad, or sort of being replicated in other places, or even what we call scale within, which means that maybe they can lead to sort of potentially like mind shifts or shifts in values within the local systems as well, and how they can sort of leading to sort of a bigger impact. So in this project, what we are doing is that we are looking into this type of local initiatives in conflict regions, and we are doing that like in a totally collaborative way, based on knowledge co-production with several GRP partners, and some of the main ones that we are working closely with are represented here. So like several different organizations, and these partners are both sort of helping us developing the aims and the way how we are doing the study and conducting the project, but also like providing us with cases that they are engaging with and that they are proposing as seeds, so sort of as these initiatives that might contribute to resilience in these conflict affected areas. And just to give you an overview, we are now sort of in a sort of a pilot phase in this project. And this map is just showing sort of where the cases, or sort of where the local seeds that we have been provided with so far are coming from. So they are mainly coming from Africa, and then some cases in Bangladesh as well. And these cases were provided by our partners. And then I just wanted to, because we don't have time to go in details on this, but what are the things that we are looking in when we are looking into these initiatives? So sort of, first we are of course, you know, trying to understand what is the general context of these local initiatives. So both in terms of social ecological interactions, what actors are involved in driving these initiatives, you know, what's the nature of the conflict in that place, what kind of like cross-scale interactions exist. So sort of, you know, which phase of the conflict, is it like proactive conflict, is it like pre-conflict? So sort of trying to understand all those very specific context things. And then we are sort of looking into sort of how are these initiatives contributing to social resilience. And for that, we are sort of being basing our analysis on these 6 principles of social resilience that are described here. And then we are sort of basically from sort of the documents that are provided from the initiatives, and also like complementary interviews, etc., seeing how these initiatives are contributing to these different dimensions of resilience. And then the next phase, which we are coming in now, is actually to see what kind of transformative potential those seeds or those initiatives might have. So there we are sort of a little bit like collecting pieces from different theories, but mainly from resilience theory and transformations theory. And then we are looking into sort of these types of categories. So like see how these initiatives are contributing to different dimensions of learning, to agent empowerment, how they are contributing to help people managing innovation and options for innovation, and how they can be using their networks to scale up also. So this is just a very, very short overview of this ongoing work that we are having together with the other GRP partners. Yeah, and I think I stop here, Albert, because we don't have so much time.
Thank you very much, Cibele. We didn't mean to stress you. We could continue a bit more, but as Cibele is alluding to, for those, I've seen people dropping in now, but towards the end of Cibele's talk, we had a bit of a technical issue in the beginning, so we started like 13 minutes late. But we'll be running to 4:15 if that's fine with everyone, just to make sure everything can fit in. So just stay with us. Thank you very much, Cibele. And we'll move on to the next speaker, who'll give us a quick slice of the work he's been doing in this field. It's Cedric Koning, who I mentioned before is a research professor in the research group on peace, conflict and development at the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs. So please, Cedric.
Thanks, Albert, and thanks, Cibele, for that lovely overview of the SEED project. I have found the concept of resilience very useful in my work, which in the last few years have been mainly in the area of policy development and applied research. And I work in the area of peace building and peacekeeping and climate-related peace and security risks, mostly in the context of the United Nations and regional organizations like the European Union and the African Union. And all these institutions have embraced resilience and have incorporated it in a variety of ways into how they understand and respond to the uncertainty and unpredictability of both the global system, as well as the specific conflicts in which they are engaged. Sorry, just one second. I just lost my notes here for a moment. There we are. Yeah, so both in terms of, as I said, the global system and the specific conflicts which they prevent and contain and manage. And my work on peace building and resilience has been informed by an engagement with complexity theory. I think complexity provides us with a theoretical framework for understanding how social systems, and here I mean both at the community level, but also at institutions at all scales, local to global, how they function under stress. And in this context, I've worked on specifically this adaptive peacebuilding approach that is aimed at supporting social systems to develop the resilience and robustness they need to cope with and adapt to change by helping them to develop greater levels of self-organization and adaptive capacity in their social institutions. And in this context, I think it's interesting to think about resilience in a number of different ways. And perhaps the two most common ones here that we could think of for a moment is kind of a more of a static thinking around resilience, or more of a dynamic, where static is kind of the bounce back to how things were type of thinking around the resilience, and dynamic is more a way of adapting or even transforming in the face of adversity. And I think depending on the duration and the intensity of the stress that social systems are under, we use both of these type of responses to stress, so that if something is fairly low intensity and fairly short in duration, then the kind of bounce back type of resilience is more relevant to kind of as a persistence or maintenance of what exists. And then if the duration or intensity is larger, we see more resilience as an adaptation to change, or even as a renewal or a transformation of social systems. And for me, this helped me to understand how resilience, or I should say resilience has strengthened our vocabulary and our narrative that helps us to understand the attributes that social systems or communities or institutions need to develop in order to be able to have adaptive capacity, and helps us to understand how we can perhaps assist systems to develop these attributes, mainly through modulating the flow of information or by stimulating the development of networks. Thank you very much. Back to you, Albert.
Thank you very much, Cedric. Really nice to kind of teasing out the main kind of dual approaches of how resilience is applied. I would say not only in peace and conflict resolution, but in many other different fields as well. We'll move on now to Jennifer Abdellah to give her the chance to give her kind of perspective on this. Jen is the program director at the Climate Resilient Development Group at the Near East Foundation. So this is very much coming from the kind of the practitioner side of things. So please, Jennifer, go ahead.
Thanks, and I'm going to share my screen as well, so bear with me while I figure that out. I'll try and do it quickly. I don't know what it's doing. Hang on one sec.
Would you like me to share it for you?
Yeah, sure, Ida, that would be awesome. Thank you. I've got a lot of exclamation points when I try to share the screen somehow, so I'm not sure what that is. Super, so thank you. Yeah, so I am going to talk about the point from the field, and I just want to say that what Cedric just talked about in terms of social systems really resonates. And I guess I'll dive in a little bit to some of the practicalities and what that looks like in our work at the Near East Foundation. And I just wanted to note that I'm talking about work that we've been doing in Mali, in central Mali, and in Sudan. And I want to give credit to my colleagues who actually do that work in Mali and Sudan, who are real pros at what they do and navigate very sensitive contexts. So that said, I'll jump in. Ida, why don't you go to the next slide, please? Thanks. So the idea really, the contexts in Mali and Sudan are kind of the usual suspects of broader regional conflict, localized competition and conflict over shared resources that are being exacerbated by environmental degradation, by climate change. The climate crisis has hit these communities already. And so the resilience approach that we take is looking at these overlapping crises, these overlapping vulnerabilities, and seeing that the solutions are also overlapping. The assets and institutions, by which I mean sort of rule systems and systems for navigating their needs and the capacities to do that are common, whether we're talking about adaptation and resilience to climate change, or if we're talking about resilience against conflict or crisis. And the second piece is that in those contexts where relationships have been frayed for any number of reasons, resilience building can actually be a vehicle for collaboration and building trust and mitigating conflict across groups that might otherwise be divided. It's not always appropriate, but sometimes that's a possibility, and we've seen that in both Mali and Sudan that that's possible to do. Next slide, please, Ida. So just a real quick generalized approach. Everything that we sort of do, an approach is participatory and trying to pull solutions and an understanding from the bottom up. So from the grassroots, what are the particular vulnerabilities or risks, priorities across diverse groups, and recognizing that it's not monolithic within communities. But through participatory processes that really build ownership and capacities as we go. Because where we're working, resources kind of underpin local economies, they underpin the local food systems, local sort of social, cultural identity. Our work really is focused on resources. So then when I talk about institutions and management, in our work, it's resource management, natural resources management. So helping to either build or strengthen existing systems and navigating across scales so that traditional systems are integrated into and reflected in sort of centralized government systems. Building the local capacities to work within those systems, to do adaptive management, to plan for adaptation, to manage conflicts when they arise. And then finally, with those priorities that emerge through the process, investing in collaborative programs or projects that reflect priorities. And that could be lots of different things, whether it's adaptive climate adaptation or a livelihoods, more focused need or something else. So next slide, please. I'm gonna just skip over this. I was gonna give a few examples, but in practice it can mean a few different things. And I'm happy to dive in maybe in the Q&A if that's of interest, but go ahead, please. Yeah. I think the real thing I want to say, I mean, we do have outcomes that we see. We see that folks emerge from this kind of work with a better common understanding of vulnerabilities and risks. We see priorities emerge across diverse groups and built capacities for resource management that is equitable and inclusive and transparent. And then with that, confidence in those systems, because folks have been involved from the get-go in the development and adaptation of those systems. With all of that, we do see an improved social cohesion and an improved confidence in governance systems. And that can ultimately lead to reduced localized conflict. I think the real key points, though, really is that these are overlapping complex problems with overlapping complex solutions. The critical point in our work is that these are grassroots solutions that emerge from local communities, and that the local communities themselves own those institutions and own those systems for managing both resources, risk, and sort of the related conflict management. Our work is not at the level of, broad geopolitical conflict. And it is true that in some cases, those conflicts can undermine some of the traditional resource systems or management systems. But in our experience, even with those broader conflicts, the social cohesion and the trend towards cooperation and collaboration, the reliance on local systems, local rule systems to navigate access to resources, those have persisted. Even in a place like central Mali that's really undergone a lot of conflict and violent conflict in the past decade or so. So that's it for me. Thank you. Happy to talk more about specifics.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Jennifer. Extremely interesting. Hopefully we can get into some of the case studies during the Q&A. It'd be fun to hear a bit more about that. And just a reminder to everyone that's listening into the webinar, please post your questions if you have any at the Q&A using the Q&A little tool at the bottom of your little toolbox on Zoom there. And if you want to direct the question to anyone specific, just mention that in the question. And without any further delay, let's move on to the final speaker, Jessica Spikers, who's a research associate with CSIRO and also at the Stockholm Resilience Center, who'll be talking a bit about future and unpredictability, thinking around conflict. Go ahead, Jessica.
Right, thank you. I will try and share my screen and see if I'm in more luck than my colleagues today. Let's see. Microsoft PowerPoint. I'm also not in luck, I think. Oh. Ida, you know what? You can share my, because I can see I have to do something with system preferences as well. I'm not sure why. All right, thank you. Great. Okay, so I will probably run through the slides relatively quick, Ida. I'll just let you know when to move ahead. So I wanted to discuss this project where we explored the future of fisheries conflict through narrative scenarios with a bunch of lovely co-authors here. And I wanted to kind of talk about this because it's a methodology that's really also inspired by resilience thinking that might be of interest to some of you that also want to explore future scenarios for peace, security, conflict, whatever side of the coin you're on, with different stakeholders, because it really lends itself to that. You can go to the next one, Ida. Thanks. So just a bit of context, as you can see, I do most of my work on fishery resources, as the title also said. So I just want to briefly mention why I focus on conflict over fishery resources. So these conflicts are kind of seen as a growing security risk, mainly because there are quite a few high-profile incidents that I'm sure some of you have also heard about, for example, in the South and East China Seas, where there are increasingly kind of tensions around marine resources and territoriality that are becoming very prominent. But also in the Mediterranean Sea, we can see conflicts between Sicilian fishermen and Libyan Coast Guard. We've seen the macro conflict in the Northeast Atlantic between the EU, Norway, Iceland, and other players that really drag on and also can have a very negative impact on the stock itself and, of course, the people dependent on them. And secondly, we're very interested in it now because the drivers of these conflicts also seem to be increasing. So first is the kind of global decline in available fishery resources. So now more than 33% of fish stocks are fished at biologically unsustainable levels, mainly attributed to overfishing, and it's worried that this will lead to a kind of securitization of the maritime sphere. Also, climate change, of course, is increasingly changing the distributions and potential yields of marine species, also impacting management and governance of these species and leading to more conflict. I can go to the next one. Right, and I wanted to pinpoint to this particular methodology that we use, because what we wanted to do is really explore different possible fishery conflict scenarios to get insight into the drivers of these conflicts, but also how they might interact in the future and what we can learn from that for governance purposes and to try and anticipate and mitigate conflict if we can. But what we do not want to do is to try and forecast or really predict where conflicts would happen, because even with the best models, that's pretty much impossible, right? So what we use is exploratory narrative scenarios. So exploratory points to the fact that we are interested in what could happen and not so much what will or what should, so more normative scenarios or more deterministic scenarios. And the narrative part is really actually quite important here, because we wanted to use storytelling techniques to increase engagement and galvanize engagement across multiple stakeholders that are interested in fisheries conflict. And this is not a new thing. So exploratory scenarios and narrative scenarios are kind of used more and more. One example that was very much an inspiration for this paper that I wanted to point to is Andrew Mary's Radical Ocean Futures. So he made 4 different scenarios for the future of global fisheries in a changing ocean. And he there called it the narrative simulation method, which has also definitely sparked a lot of engagement with a large audience. I can go to the next one, Ida. So just to quickly show you the nuts and bolts of this type of methodology. So first, we kind of conceptualize conflict. What is fisheries conflict, right? So set up a common framework of reference. What we then did is select case regions, and we wanted to select case regions where we know that fishery conflict is already an issue or is increasingly becoming an issue. That's the Northeast Atlantic, East China Sea, coast of West Africa, and the Arctic. That's where our scenarios will be taking place. And we use as data for this step, we held a workshop with multiple experts in fishery conflicts and other fields. And we also use a conflict database to make sure that conflicts are actually already occurring in these areas. So these are kind of important areas to look at. The third step was to identify kind of the conflict drivers and the trends of those drivers. And we also did this in the workshop. So with multiple people, we sat around and we said, what can really drive conflict, fisheries conflict? And we found 22 variables of importance that can be political, economic, social, environmental. And then we use those drivers and the trends of those drivers to really create the scenarios. And important here is that some of those drivers are amplified in certain scenarios. So if we know that some drivers are very much active in the Arctic, for example, impacts of climate change, then that will be very obvious in our scenario. And we try to amplify that through storytelling techniques. And what we also did once our scenarios were set up is to send it out to experts in the region. I'm not an expert on the Arctic or on the coast of West Africa, and so it's important to bounce that back with really experts of the regions and say, well, does this make sense to you? But more importantly, where could we be wrong? Where would you see the scenario actually going otherwise? Where would the trend maybe bend and something else would happen? And that really gave us a more diversified portfolio of different scenarios, if you will, to really look at what the future could hold for the Arctic and not just our future. Yeah, I can go to the next slide. So just to give one example of a scenario that came out of this. So this is a scenario for the coast of West Africa, taking place in 2045. And what happened in the scenario as we wrote it is that there was a deadly confrontation between small-scale fisher people and massive international trawlers. And after that, fishers across West Africa started banding together to take back control of their fisheries and to take back control of their infrastructure in a move that we call oceanic decolonization. So they use a judicial system here in this scenario to fight unfair access agreements, unfair investments, and wanting to put an end of decades of foreign exploitation by distant water fishing fleets from Spain and China and other countries. And so on the right here in this figure, maybe I don't think I can do this with my mouse, but you can kind of see the enlarged balls here, if you will. So those are the those are the drivers that we really focus on in this scenario. So the amplified drivers that are apparent in our scenario. And I'll just read an excerpt so that I can also kind of show you what the narrative part would sound like, right? So this is part of our scenario. For years, we could not gain access to our own fishing grounds, occupied by enormous hulking mothership trawlers and their fleets of buzzing smaller boats posing as small-scale fishers. We were forced to buy back fish landed by international vessels at 5 times the price. Out of frustration, the rebel movement grew, with some fisher people setting up headquarters on a rusty, decommissioned oil rig. We had already teamed up with the vigilante sea wolves to make a stand and push away these vessels from our coast, but many of us were losing patience. It was honestly feeling like a losing battle because we knew our rebellion would never make a difference as long as these access agreements existed, as long as foreign investments dominated our infrastructure and our resources. You can go to the next one, Ida. I won't give too much text with this one, too much explanation, but basically we also worked together and teamed up with an illustrator to also make beautiful little movies for our different scenarios. And this again is something that really exploratory and narrative scenarios lends itself to, right? Like you can try and increase engagement with a wider audience by making these little, this is a GIF. And I will link you to the website where you can see the different videos that we have for the different scenarios in case you're interested, but I will go to the final slide now. So basically what I want you to take away from this very short talk is these types of scenarios, exploratory narrative scenarios, can really be useful for building anticipatory capacity. So what can we really learn from this type of methodology? First, what we learned was to understand our system, what really drives conflict, in our case, fisheries conflict. And for an example of what we've learned is that in some systems, vulnerability to conflict is higher, right? Like there's just more pressure points in the system, socioeconomic, environmental, political pressure points that can easily kind of catapult a system into conflict. Another thing we've learned is that conflict is not always bad. That's maybe something we can also discuss. It can be a catalyzer for peace or a transformation point for peace as well, and for more equity. But more importantly, altogether, what this methodology does is create stories that can be very compelling to discuss and explore alternative future together with a range of different stakeholders. They can allow us to identify variables that need to be activated to unlock different trajectories and then debate why that would be. We can reveal uncertainties or possible leverage points in the system. And I think most importantly, maybe is galvanize kind of a wider policy discussion around these types of scenarios and futures for different regions. And I will leave it at that and move on to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Jessica. Thanks to all the four speakers for a great and diverse presentation of different perspectives pertaining to resilience in this field. I mean, and it really struck me. I think an important take-home message among the many take-home messages of this webinar is that resilience is this kaleidoscope. It's a framework with a mass of different tools, perspectives, and theories that provide a very systemic picture of a problem at hand. It can be very much on the ground ways of programming resilience to understand the capacities on a local scale that can allow communities to thrive in an ever-changing future. But it can also be the stuff that Jessica alluded to. I mean, a very kind of exploratory, future-looking tools that give a sense, not a prescriptive way, but at least a sense of the direction of some of these key drivers and the trends of future conflict, which can be extremely useful for policymakers. It's 8 minutes to 4, and like we said before, because of the bit of the glitch in the beginning, we'll be pushing on a bit longer, and certainly your next meeting can't be as interesting as this one. So please, we urge you to stick around until 4:15 Central European time, just to hear the end of the discussion. If you have any questions, please add them to the Q&A down in your little toolbox. I have a lot of questions to ask the panelists, but you certainly just don't want to listen to me talking all the time. But I'll open it up, and I've got a question to you, Cibele, but it goes out to all the speakers. But Cibele, you get to answer it first. I mean, the title of this webinar, it alludes to the Anthropocene, right? And the Anthropocene, we can talk about it for a long time, but one key dynamic of the Anthropocene is that local contexts are no longer only shaped by what's happening in the locale on a local scale, but they're also very strongly shaped by these big global changes, hyperconnectivity in trade, political, migration, transboundary processes, right? So just a quick reflection, what challenges and opportunities do these dynamics, these really strong cross-scale dynamics present both within science and practice? And I'm starting with you, Cibele, because the seeds of the Good Anthropocene project is all about, you know, these small things happening on a small scale that can affect the bigger scale of things.
Yeah, thanks, Albert. I mean, as you say, like, it's the Anthropocene is very complex, and mainly what we know is that we don't know so much about it, but we know that sort of uncertainty is increasing at a fast pace, right? So like that we have drivers of change becoming more and more unpredictable, which will lead to a higher frequency of shocks and surprises. And then we know also that because of the global nature of our planet, as you said, like, you know, nothing is isolated anymore. So you can have both like global shocks as the pandemics, and you can have local shocks that also spread into other parts of the world because we're so interdependent through trade, etc. And I guess that yeah, thinking on your question, I think that, I mean, means many things, but I can highlight a couple. So like first, the fact that this border between the local and global gets blurred, you know, then I guess that we need to rethink, and I guess many of us are doing that a lot, but like sort of both the way how we do research, but also the way how we are sort of implementing things in practice. So like, you know, of course, that if you are a practitioner from a civil society organization or from a regional or even local government, and you are sort of, you know, implementing a package of like very sort of specific measures to address a problem or an issue, we need to be very aware that the action cannot only be local, because, you know, so you do have to take into account that whatever you're seeing is not just affected by what's happening within the community, but that no communities are isolated. So they are affected by regional scales, by global scales, by sort of drivers coming, you know, from all, also from like telecoupled sort of drivers from other parts of the world. So like you need to have that into account. And also for us as scientists, it gets much harder to sort of, you know, put the boundaries of our research, you know, like you're studying a study case, but then suddenly it's not just happening there. You suddenly realize like you can't understand a reality of a particular context without actually putting it into a broader context. And then the other thing I think that, you know, for us, like working in the Anthropocene and living in the Anthropocene, we need to think about, it's also that, I guess that we need to acknowledge more and more that our capacity and there's a limitation on our capacity of predicting things. And I guess that as a scientist, you know, that's kind of difficult because we are used to the fact that our science got better and better into predicting things, to predicting, you know, different scenarios of how things can happen. And right now we are at a point that the uncertainties, it's just so high that it isn't possible to predict. I mean, we can do multiple scenarios, but we also know that you know, the real one can look totally different because there might be like thresholds, there might be like all the kinds of multiple interactions, you know, that just might look totally different. And I guess that also both as scientists, but also as practitioners, that means that this is also a bit personal for me, but I think personally, I think that means that we need to shift from searching for solutions, because solutions are very sort of, I guess solutions are very sort of bounded to a particular problem, you know, but when you don't know what the problem will be, you can't just, you know, being stuck on solutions. But I think that what we need to work through is into how do you build flexibility in the system to actually deal with what you don't know that will come. So like, how do you build the capacity to actually cope with that uncertainty, much more than actually to search for the solution for that problem that will come, because it might not be that one, it might be something totally different. So I think that's where resilience comes, you know, and that's where I guess that's the value of our research and the work of all of us and several colleagues around the world. It's a bit about building that capacity. So like both, both in science and practice.
Thanks, Cibele, for really highlighting that the uncertainty of the Anthropocene and perhaps the need to shift away from blueprint focus on the big S word solutions, which has become a big fascination within the policy world, and think a bit broader than that, the capacities and the process to provide flexibility. I have a question now that popped up in the Q&A. I think I'll prioritize that one before moving on to some of the questions I pre-prepared, just to give it the chance to air it before a lot of folks log out if they have to. It's by an anonymous attendee, and I guess it's out to the whole panelists, so I'll let the four of you choose who gets to first stab. But the question is, what is the role, or what do you think the role of Indigenous people and their knowledge in the Anthropocene is, especially in this field of conflict and peace? What role can that have when so many Indigenous people are still overlooked in many parts of the world? And maybe, Jen, I mean, maybe I can leave it to you, because I guess maybe some of the similar things of how local communities and their knowledge get implemented in some of this resilience programming based on your work and experience in Mali and Sudan and all other places in the world that Neary's Foundation works. So I'll let you have a stab first at that question.
Thank you. I think it's a really good and important question, not maybe surprising based on what we do, but I agree with Cibele that what we, building the capacities and flexible systems that can identify solutions is what we need to do, but those systems need to recognize sources of knowledge from diverse sources, but especially from the people who are on the front lines of the risk and the vulnerability. And so to me, the answer is the role of Indigenous peoples and their knowledge is preeminent. It's the most critical thing to build into these local systems. We're talking about big global risks, the Anthropocene, the only thing we know is we don't know and it's uncertain. But that gets felt at a very local level. Right, so those dynamics play out at a very local level, and people, variability is not a new idea. If you talk to someone who's living in central Mali or in Darfur, variability is something that folks have coped with forever, and there are strategies for coping with variability and strategies for coping with stress in those systems. So I think recognizing that instead of trying to superimpose some kind of external knowledge is critical. I think we need to also look for space for respectful two-way dialogue at that level though too, because there is a lot happening and there's a lot of new, technologies and ideas and south-south learning, and there's a lot of room for cross-pollination, and it's important. But I think that if we do that at the expense of recognizing local knowledge, we've really lost out on the source of different strategies that can be successful.
Thank you, Jen. Anyone else from the panelists want to have a stab at building on what Jennifer had to say there, or should we move on to the next question?
I can just add very quickly that, like, just building on, I also think it's an extremely relevant question. And I think that, I guess that one of the things that I think we talk a lot about now, but it's really difficult to do. It's exactly like to ensure this pluralism of voices and experiences and knowledge, in sort of coalitions that can contribute to positive change in that turbulent, like in these turbulent times. And I think that's extremely necessary. But so far we haven't been super good in that. I think that we are getting better. We are trying to sort of give voice to voices that have been marginalized. But I think it's an ongoing process, I would say. But that's what we need. We need very plural sort of voices in decision making and in multi-stakeholder sort of platforms, I would say.
Can I add one asterisk to that?
Absolutely, Jen.
It's not just recognizing knowledge or voice, it's resources. So there's also, Cibele just mentioned decision making. Local communities need to have control over resources that allow them to implement adaptive strategies and build their resilience. So I think it's in some ways easier to talk about respecting knowledge and respecting voice. It's harder to sometimes put the money where the mouth is, and I think there's a need for that.
Thanks both of you. We have another question pop up here, which is around how one can integrate the concept of the Anthropocene in NDC reports, so the National Determined Contributions within the context of the UNFCCC. I guess I can expand on that a bit, and I can pass it on to you to begin with, Cedric. So the question can be broadened to say, just in general, how are issues of climate security and climate resilience incorporated and discussed within different policy spheres, from the Security Council to the local. So how are they being currently discussed? And then how do you integrate things like climate resilience, climate security, and the whole dynamics of the Anthropocene within those same policy spheres? So it's a dual question, a tricky one, but how about you have a stab?
I'll try. One of the areas I'm currently working on is a project where we are working at generating evidence of specific countries that is on the agenda of the Security Council, and how climate-related security risks are affecting, let's say, the conflicts or the peace process in those particular countries. And through that, the Security Council is one forum. There's many you've mentioned, but through that, it's very interesting to see how, at that high political diplomatic level, the discussions are also linked to what we've discussed earlier, right, with the local. On the one hand, you have, for instance, very often briefers from civil society from those particular countries that speak directly at the Security Council. And sometimes the messages they bring is, I think, quite important in helping to shape the debate. And then it's very interesting to see how, for instance, specifically in this area of climate-related security risks, when you talk about it more broadly, there's kind of lots of national politics and interests that come into play. But when you talk about it in the context of a specific country, so for instance, in Jens' example of Mali and the transhumance or herder pastoralist type conflicts that take place there that could be climate-related, when particular examples of that kind of instances are brought to the Security Council and are made relevant to, for instance, a resolution they have to adopt about the mandate for the United Nations mission in Mali, then you can see how it becomes real also for the people on the Security Council, and how those issues then become more kind of practical or programmatic, as opposed to, you know, highly political. So I think it's interesting to see how those local global links play out, even when it comes to Security Council resolutions, and also downstream from that, how important is a particular concept or a sentence in a resolution, how that could have an effect on what people prioritize at the national level or in missions, what resources they are given. And so I think it's a lot of this linkages are being made now. And speaking also back to our earlier question, I mean, I think this science is also advanced to the point where we are now able to more clearly make those linkages between what's happening at the local level and the other scales of influence, and to be able to present that in a more clearly understandable way at different levels, that then enable politicians and policymakers to perhaps make more relevant decisions in this regard. Back to you, Albert.
Thank you very much, Cedric. Maybe just to build up a bit upon that, just to kind of reflect to the question as well. I think it's a great question. It's a complex issue. I mean, integrating the concept of the Anthropocene in the NDCs stumbles upon the main problem is that, firstly, the Anthropocene is just so much more than just emissions and climate change. It's a whole suite of systemic risks, drivers, changes, actors, agency. You know, it's a big living social ecological system that we live in, right? Although, just, you know, I don't have a clear answer to that, more than to say that there's progress being made, at least in the direction of trying to understand how resilient principles or some attributes of resilience or adaptive capacity attributes are embedded within the NDCs. There's a kind of a surge in research groups and policymakers working together, trying to understand how that. So there's some progress, but, you know, integrating the full concept of the Anthropocene in the NDCs, maybe that's just too complex for the NDCs to do, is maybe a simple way of looking at that. And finally, I think we have time for one last question, and it's actually addressed to Jessica. It's come through the chat here, and I'll build upon that as well. The question is, you know, just like any other research methods, what are some of the ethical challenges that come with the use of future scenario building? So I'll let you answer that, Jessica, but I'll also add to that a slightly added dimension to that. You know, there's been a huge focus by donor organizations, you know, multilaterals, governments, trying to recognize the need for proactive rather than reactive approaches when it comes to resilience building. So how, just like concretely, if you can give like a couple of ways that these people that are interested in this can ensure actionable foresight and anticipatory capacities in a good way that can actually link to policy decisions. If you just have any thoughts, given the notion of your work, but I'll let you start with the ethical dimensions of your work before going on to the higher level.
I will. So it really made me think as I saw the question pop up, and I was like, yeah, that's a good question. Because in my mind, the type of methodology I use to build scenarios is, I think it actually has its origin in the commercial sector, where they're trying to use this methodology kind of to forego some ethical dilemma. So I think in the commercial sector, it's been used to understand the effects of like emerging technologies, for example. So what are the impacts? How can people actually start using technology that we're inventing right now? And how will this transform society, and what might be the impacts? And so I think in that sense, I think if you include enough stakeholders and you're being honest and you really think through who you should include in the conversation, which, to be fair, I don't think I've done to the right extent, even with my project. I think it's always better to engage with more people, people that live in regions themselves, for example. That of course is an important element of it, but as long as you kind of abide, I suppose, by those kind of ethical boundaries of engaging with the right people that are actually affected by the scenarios that you're writing, or that really live the experiences of the scenarios that you're writing, I think it can actually be a tool to explore ethical issues in the future. So I don't know if I'm now turning the question on its head, and it sounds like I'm trying to not answer the question, but I honestly think it can be, that's what it's been used for in the commercial sector, at least, is to try and explore ethical issues through scenario building, right? So I think I'm hoping that who the anonymous person is that asked it, I might leave it at that and see if you're satisfied or if you want to discuss further. But yeah, and just, I mean, kind of to your question still, Albert, I think what was useful about this methodology as well and how it kind of links to the Anthropocene is that scenarios, I mean, decades ago, a lot of the scenarios were built around kind of one issue, right? Like, oh, carbon dioxide, how will this kind of change in the future? What will the effects be? Which is great. Like, this is the way that I'm approaching it is more of it's a complement to other more quantitative and more deterministic kinds of forecasts, right? It's not supposed to completely replace it at all, but I think it's an important complement because just kind of focusing on one element doesn't do the Anthropocene justice, right? We know that it's about the cumulative totality of different drivers and different issues, not only carbon dioxide, but in the field of oceans, it's overfishing, it's different types of pollution. And if you don't look at the interactions between these elements, and if you don't try to find a strategic way of building scenarios around the multitude of drivers and issues, you will just end up building scenarios that honestly are just not appropriate, I think, for the age that we live in. When I was writing these scenarios, I honestly had times where I thought, what am I doing? Is this scientifically valid? Like, is this the right way to approach it? But then, for example, Trump wanted to buy Greenland. And I think, how can you know, crazy things do happen in the world. And we need to find a way to kind of use these black swan events or completely unexpected geopolitical shifts, right? We need to find a way to try and include that in our vision of the future, because that's what the Anthropocene is, right? It's as we said, uncertainty and multiple drivers and complexity. But yeah, I'm hoping that I answered that question about the ethics. I'm wondering if the person that asked it had something in mind that I may be overlooking. So let's see.
You did a great job, Jessica. Thanks. Thank you very much to all the panelists, and thank you to the audience for dropping in a bit late, but for sticking around and being part of this really rich discussion. It's been streamed live as well on Facebook, and I think it's been recorded. So you can watch it afterwards, or you can share it around with your networks. I'll leave it at that, unless any of our panelists has any kind of final closing remarks based on some of the questions or the discussion that popped in now at the end. If not, then I'll give you at least a bit of a virtual applaud. Thank you very much for joining us, and we'll see you, as many of you as possible, in the next GRP learning webinar, but we'll send out information about that at a later stage. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.